All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Brookline Booksmith's author event series. My name is Silas. If you're familiar with our store, welcome back. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. Please keep your phones on silent. You can always buy a book from me in the back or pick up a pre-ordered book, and there will be a Q&A, so get your questions ready. We're here tonight to celebrate the release of Locust Lane with author Stephen Amidon. Stephen was born in Chicago and grew up on the East Coast. He lived in London, and he now lives in Massachusetts, as well as in Torino, Italy. Quite the world traveler, you see myself. His books have been published in 16 countries and include 2 works of nonfiction, a collection of short stories, and 7 novels, including Human Capital, adapted as a film directed by Mark Myers in 2019, and Security, also adapted as a film and released by Netflix in summer 2021. Welcome. Locust Lane is a taut and utterly propulsive story about the search for justice and the fault lines of power and influence in a seemingly idyllic town. On the surface, Emerson, Massachusetts is just like any other affluent New England suburb. But when a young woman is found dead in the nicest part of town, the powerful neighbors close ranks to keep their families safe. In this searing novel, Eden Perry's death kicks off an investigation into the 3 teenagers who were partying with her that night, each a suspect. Hannah, a sweet girl with an unstable history, Jack, the popular kid with a mean streak, and Christopher, an outsider desperate to fit in. Their parents, each with their own motivations, only complicate the picture. They will do anything to protect their children, even at others' expense. The question really is, can anyone be trusted? And here to help us flesh out the mystery is the author himself, Stephen.
Thank you. No, they can't. Thank you all for coming. And before I start reading, I want to do a trigger warning. Is it? No animals were permanently injured in the making of this book, and the dog is fine. I'm going to read 3 short sections from the book. They're kind of continuous, and they involve alcoholic investment banker named Patrick Noon, and then later the mother of Eden, who you just heard about. So we'll start with the prologue. He hit the dog on Locust. It came out of nowhere, a blur of dark motion. He swerved, but not enough. The bumper's edge caught the animal's hindquarters, sending it spinning back into the night. Its yelp harmonized with the shriek of breaking tires. And then he'd stopped in the middle of the road, his heart racing, thinking that maybe going out for a drive wasn't such a good idea after all. It took him a moment to locate the stricken animal. It had fled back the way it had come, but only made it as far as the nearest lawn, where it was now turning in circles, nipping at its flank, locked in futile pursuit of its pain. It finally lay down and began to lick furiously at the point of impact. The dog was big and black, a Labrador, maybe, or a Labrador and something else. Patrick didn't know dogs. He checked the nearby houses to see if lights were flaring as homeowners in robes emerged onto front porches, but all was quiet. The dashboard clock read 3:11 a.m. It was entirely possible the event had gone unnoticed by the residents of Locust Lane. The setbacks here were deep, the windows tightly sealed. Trees shrouded most of the house fronts. Things that happened on the street were a long way off. The dog continued to nurse its wound, though its movement suggested a recovery was in progress. Patrick told himself to drive on. He wasn't at fault. Dogs weren't allowed to run free in Emerson. Everybody knew that. A 6-foot leash was required. There were signs everywhere, and he was not necessarily under the legal limit. The last thing he needed was to wind up walking the sobriety tightrope for some yawning cop. Go home, he thought. Finish the bottle, hit the sack. You know the drill. Dawn will come, followed by another barren day. But he couldn't do it. He'd injured a living thing. That made him responsible for it. He had to help. He didn't need another item in the overladen shopping cart of guilt he was already pushing around. He'd made a deal with himself not to abandon decency. He could leave behind everything else, but not that. He pulled the car to the side of the road. The dog remained curled on the grass, although its fussing was with its flank although it was fussing with its flank less avidly. Having committed himself to helping, Patrick now understood that he had no idea what to do. Loading a large, frightened, and potentially bloody creature into his M3 and transporting it to an all-night animal hospital was out of the question, and he certainly wasn't dragging it back home. Whatever he was going to do would have to be done right here. The best he could come up with was to see if there was a tag on its collar, a number to call. He got out of the car. The dog watched him, waiting for the human being to define the situation. "Good boy," Patrick said, although he had no evidence that the dog was either of these things. It emitted a brief whine, more of a radar ping than a call for help. It was taking the measure of this creature who'd brought the pain. Its tail quivered in an unfriendly way. Patrick held out his right hand as a gesture of peace, palm down, fingers dangling, like royalty expecting a kiss. This was more or less the extent of his knowledge of canine communication. He'd never had a dog. The wounded animal rose shakily, holding its back right paw a few inches off the grass. Standing was a good sign. No spinal damage, presumably no vital organs ruptured. It could limp back home to be cared for by the idiot who'd let it run free in the middle of the night. Patrick turned back to his car, but froze when the dog growled. Low and ominous, like a waste disposal ready for debris. He turned to face it. Previously flat fur on the back of its neck had risen into a staticky bristle. It took a menacing step forward. That injured leg seemed to be getting better by the second. Okay, Patrick thought, time to call it a night. He showed the dog his hand again, this time offering a flat palm, a cop stopping traffic. There was no need for drama. Whoever's name was on that collar could take it from here. Get themselves a 6-foot leash and obey the damned law. He took a backward step. The dog took a mirroring step forward. Patrick wondered if his hand gestures meant something entirely different to the dog than what he'd intended. He cast a quick glance over his shoulder. He'd left the car door open. That was good. Safety was just a quick 5 strides away. He was pretty sure he could make it there before a 3-legged dog. Then the animal turned its head, its attention drawn to something in a thick copse of trees that separated the residential behemoth directly in front of Patrick from the even larger house next door. Patrick followed its gaze. At first, all he could see was varying degrees of nothingness. The trees were dense, knotted together by a network of vines. Then something defined itself, a man-sized delineation of the darkness, a human being, tall, broad-shouldered, watching from 100 feet away. What the fuck? Is this your dog? Patrick called out. There was no response. Hello? Nothing. This made no sense. Why would the dog's owner be hiding in the trees? The town's leash penalties weren't that harsh, unless it wasn't the dog's owner. But vagabonds and lurkers weren't exactly common in Emerson. As far as he knew, the town's homeless population consisted of a small, ever-shifting squad of men cooling their heels at the Hilton after getting booted by aggrieved wives. He should know, having been one of them last year. He looked back at the dog just as it made up its mind about whomever it had been seen in the shadows and turned its attention back to Patrick. At which point it made up its mind about him as well, and not in a positive way. Its growl deepened. It took another ominous step forward, the kind of murderous stealth on display in cable shows about the Serengeti. That injured leg appeared to have undergone a full recovery. Time to go, with haste. Resurrecting a move from his wide receiver days, Patrick emphatically stamped his right foot forward, then pivoted and headed in the opposite direction. All he needed to be home free was 5 strides, a nifty spin into the car, and a slammed door, and he almost made it. His front foot was already in when there was a sharp explosion of pain on his trailing hamstring. The dog had bitten him. Luckily, its jaws didn't find purchase. Patrick's momentum allowed him to reach the driver's seat and pull the door shut behind him. It didn't latch, however, slamming instead into a cushion of bone and tissue, the dog's head. There was an ear-shattering yelp, followed by a whimpering retreat. Patrick pulled the door all the way closed as the dog limped off toward that dense copse, where a hidden man had just impassively watched it attack another human being. Patrick gingerly probed the back of his injured thigh. The trousers were torn, but there was no evidence of blood. The adrenaline continued to pump, fueling anger now. What the hell had just happened? Why hadn't that asshole intervened? Had he given the dog some sort of secret attack command? Patrick turned on his engine and maneuvered until his high beams illuminated the woods. But there was no one there, just trees and vines, and of course the darkness, patiently waiting for the end of this frantic little interruption of its dominion. Back at the house, Patrick stripped off his torn pants and inspected the wound. The skin hadn't been broken, though he suspected there was a nasty bruise to come. He slathered it with antiseptic cream just to be safe, then applied an ice pack. For the relief of pain, a large tumbler of Suntory and 2 ibuprofen. It was now approaching 4. He should be in bed. He should have been in bed when the dog was biting him. He should have been in bed when he decided to go for a drive. But a dream had awakened him, driving him clean out of the house. Not a dream, really, but a disembodied voice, clearer and closer than any dream could ever be. Dad, can you come get me? It had not been from when Gabby was a girl, sunny and carefree, needing to be picked up from soccer practice for an afternoon at the mall. Nor was it her latter self, pleading and ravaged and shattered, calling from a borrowed burner or reversing the $24.99 a minute charge from a jailhouse payphone. No, this call had come from the here and now, from the young woman she would have been, confident, a little impatient, on the cusp of her adult life, doing her father a favor by allowing him to do this favor for her. He wasn't in bed when she spoke to him, but rather in his old recliner, the only piece of furniture he'd extracted from his vanished life. It took him a minute to find his bearings. He wore the clothes he changed into after work, Dockers and a polo shirt. There was a tumbler filled with whiskey-tinted ice melt and a bowl of pistachio shells on the table beside him. The Discovery Channel was broadcasting a muted show about bearded men on a boat fighting the elements. Sleep banished, he'd driven. He followed a random course through town. He turned left, he turned right. It didn't matter as long as he kept moving. Adams to Cabot, St. James to Smith, and then on to Rockingham. On Center, through the town's center, where nothing was open, but everything was brightly lit. Past the high school, where a lone car sat in the vast lot, sodium light raining down over it like a warm drizzle. Past the mini mobile mart, where a hopper-esque figure sat encased in bulletproof glass, and then on to Locust, where the black dog crossed his path. He should try to get some sleep in the small patch of night remaining, although that wouldn't come unassisted, not with the pain in his leg, the residual adrenaline still coursing through his veins, the old thirst still there. And so he topped up on the Japanese wonder drug and contemplated that figure in the woods. The more he thought about it, the more it pissed him off. He couldn't imagine anyone in this town failing to intervene as their dog got hit, attacked a stranger, and then was pancaked by a slamming door. That animal had probably had more spent on its well-being than 3/4 of the world's children, and yet not a peep from the woods. If the man just happened to be there by coincidence, then what was he doing there? It didn't add up. He contemplated calling the police to report a prowler, a dog on the loose. But he could see how that call would go. They listened patiently, sent a patrol car to Locust, find nothing. Besides, Patrick wasn't exactly on the best of terms with the local cops. No, this was over and done with. He decided to allot himself 3 more drinks. That would do the trick, filling in the 3 looming hours before he'd have to rise and shine, before the wasteland of the morning would finally creep into view. Okay, so then we'll jump forward to, so this is the next couple days later, outside the same house. Danielle, the mother of Eden, the girl who was murdered in one of the houses Patrick had stood in front of, has come to the house to just try to figure out what's going on. Danielle is an outsider. She's a jewelry saleswoman from Watertown. Emerson is another land to her. Her daughter was staying in the house as a house sitter for the wealthy people who are elderly people who are living there. Danielle wound up parked across the street from the Bondurants. The house was protected by its wall of trees, not a place you'd randomly approach, but also a place where you wouldn't be seen from the street if you did show up at the front door. This would have been how things were when it happened. Quiet, dark, apparently safe. She thought about the killer arriving. Had Eden invited him in? Or had he come unannounced and unexpected, someone she knew only in passing, a mere stranger who secretly coveted her? Danielle became aware of another presence. A man had appeared, walking along the side of the road toward the house. He didn't seem to be a cop or a reporter. He wore nice clothes, and his hair was cut right. He stopped at the top of the driveway, and it was then that she placed him. He'd been the one she'd seen earlier at the police station. We know Danielle had seen Patrick at the police station. They were both being questioned. She got out of the car, shutting the door quietly so as not to scare him off. He turned, unsurprised, as she drew near. "I saw you earlier," she said. "I remember. Yeah, so I got a question. Who exactly are you?" "Just a curious bystander," he said after a moment. Her eyes were getting used to the light. He was attractive, but as she glimpsed back at the station, soft, like he'd been basted in a light batter of money. His Beamer, which for some reason he'd parked in front of the house next door, looked like it was worth about 2 years of her salary. Men like this tended not to be bystanders to anything. If they were present, it was about them. "But why were you talking to the cops?" she asked. "You're the mother, right?" "Yeah, I'm her mother." "I'm really sorry," he said, his voice so gentle she had to lean forward a little to hear it. "Thank you, but I'm still sort of wondering who you are and why you're here. Really, I don't want to intrude." "You kind of already have, though," she said. He continued to look around the house, toward the house. "Come on, help me out," she continued. "The cops sure aren't." "I wouldn't put too much faith in the local police." She could now detect the slightest slur. Everything was a little too slow. He'd been drinking. It took a minute to see, but it was there. "Oh yeah?" she asked. "Why's that?" He shrugged. She decided to try a new approach. "What's your name?" "Patrick." "Danielle." Shaking hands would have just been too weird. "I mean, look at this from my point of view," she said. "I see you at the station talking to detectives. Then I see you here. There's got to be a reason for that. Please." There wasn't a word that usually came tripping off her tongue. For in frequency, it was right up there with sorry. He seemed to sense that. "I hit a dog," he said. "Okay. Last night, when I was driving by here." "What, like a big black dog?" "You know it?" She pointed toward the house. "That's theirs, the Bondurants. My daughter was looking after it. Thor. I saw him a couple of hours ago. How's he doing?" "He'll live." "He bit me?" "Really?" "Really? He doesn't seem like much of a biter." "I guess he was having a rough night." Patrick winced. "Oh, I'm sorry." She shook off the apology. "So you hit the dog and it didn't seem to hurt, so I just went home. And it didn't seem to hurt, so I just went home. And then when I saw the news, I thought it was something the cops should know. And you're here now because what? You're this big dog lover?" He stopped. The words were there on his tongue. He was trying to decide if he should say them. "What? There was what?" He shook his head. "I just wish there was something I could have done," he said. "Yeah, me too." He looked at her, and she knew her words had come out far more harshly than she intended. "What I mean is, I wish there was something I could have done as well." "I should go," he said. "Damn it, Danielle," she thought. "This isn't some drywall you're dealing with. Use some finesse." He reached into his pocket and took out his wallet. For a moment, she had the crazy thought that he was about to give her money, but he produced a business card. "If you want to talk." "Hey, we're talking now," she said. "Things might come up later. They might be clearer." Now, what the hell did that mean, she thought. He continued to offer the card. She took it. She had to angle it toward the street light to read the name. "No one?" she asked. "It's pronounced noon," he smiled, "but I answer to both." Once again, he seemed to regret his joke immediately. "I'm really, really sorry about your child." Parting words, though he stood his ground. He met her eye, and it occurred to her that this guy, this Patrick Noon, wasn't crazy, and he wasn't a creep. No, there was something there that she didn't understand but couldn't turn away from. "Just because she's dead doesn't mean she's gone," he said. The drink suddenly vanished from his voice. "Okay," she said after a stunned silence. "But you'll find it's up to you to keep her alive." It was up to me last night. No, this is different. How? It's hard to explain, but you'll see. He smiled at her, then turned and walked away. His car sounded like 3 cars when he turned over the engine. As he drove past her, he gave her a brief blind wave. She used the card he'd given her to wave back. And one more section here, short. This is the next day. Danielle is still trying to figure out what's going on. She's still completely at a loss. She has no cooperation from the local cops. They haven't arrested. They've just made an arrest in the murder, but she doesn't believe it's the right one. She's not sure. So this is what she does. She thought about Patrick Noon, wondering how he fit into this all. Lost on the streets of his own town at 3 a.m, drunk probably, maybe even crazy in a way Danielle didn't yet understand. His story about the dog would have been difficult to believe if she herself hadn't seen the damn thing limping. She should be taking everything this man told her with a boulder-sized grain of salt, but for some reason she trusted him, and there was something he still couldn't bring himself to say. For the 1000th time since their improbable late-night meeting outside the Bondurins last night, she could hear that unfinished sentence. The card he'd handed her was in her purse. It was black and white, yet somehow radiant. The letters were raised a little. It made her want to run her thumb over them, like she was blind. It suggested the world she'd never inhabited, a place where things were easy. To her surprise, she was put right through. To her even greater surprise, he agreed to meet her. But it was no surprise at all that he suggested a bar out on Route 9. The Royal Lounge looked like it had been in business continuously since they invented liquor. She arrived first. Finding a booth wasn't a challenge. The REO Speedwagon song playing on the cheap speakers sounded like someone was vacuuming the back room. A fat drinker at the bar turned laboriously to check her out. She narrowed her eyes, and he kept turning laboriously until he was facing the bar again, a surprisingly graceful pirouette of rejection. Patrick Noon arrived, wearing an expensive suit and sunglasses that the boys she'd grown up with would have risked prison time to steal. Whatever else he might have been, the man certainly was attractive. He had the good grace not to smile at her as he slid into the booth. When he took off his glasses, the whites of his eyes were as clear as his business card, and he didn't smell of alcohol, at least no more than the booth's ruptured naugahyde seats. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "I don't know, functioning." "Functioning is good. Better than the opposite anyway." "Is it?" she asked. He asked her what she wanted to drink. She said Chardonnay because she wanted a drink but didn't want that much of a drink. He went to get their refreshments. A bartender, a short woman in her 60s who looked like she'd rather be working just about anywhere else on God's green earth than the Royal Lounge, greeted Patrick Noon familiarly. He stared at the bar as he waited for the drinks. Danielle took the opportunity to study him. To say he didn't belong in this place was an understatement. He looked like he belonged in one of those downtown clubs whose heavy doors were guarded by men dressed like they were protecting the Queen of England. "This could be colder," he said apologetically as he placed the wine glass in front of her. She shrugged. She hadn't come for the Chardonnay. He was drinking something clear with a slice of lime. There was an interval of silence that would normally have been filled with small talk. He seemed comfortable inhabiting it with her. "So I'm wondering why they haven't arrested this kid yet," she said finally. "What have the police told you about that?" "Nothing. What do you know about him?" "I know his father. He has a restaurant in town." He paused. "People are surprised." "Are you?" she asked. "I'm not really surprised by much these days. But yeah, I am. It just doesn't fit. I'm sorry if that's uncomfortable for you to hear, but there it is." He took a drink like he needed it. Not gulping it down exactly, but savoring it. "You said something last night," she said. "Well, you started to say something." He watched her, not unfriendly, just guarded. "You said there was, and then you stopped yourself." "Did I?" "Yes, you did. Like you saw something other than the dog when you stopped your car." He looked into his glass as he swirled the ice and lime. This man had something to say to her, and she had no idea how to get him to say it except give him time. "I lost a daughter," he said, 2 years ago. "Oh no," she said. "I'm sorry to hear that." She'd been struggling with drug addiction. "Well, damn. Situations aren't really equivalent, I guess." "Dead is dead," Danielle said. "That seems pretty equivalent to me." "How old was she?" 20, same as Eden. He met her eye, this lost man. What was her name? Gabriella, Gabby. That's nice. As is Eden. How did you come up with that? I thought, innocence. I was young. I didn't take into consideration the whole apple and snake deal. He took a sip. She looked at her wine. It brought to mind a urine sample. She left it where it was. So that's why you gave me your card? He finished his drink. You want another? He asked. I probably should go ahead and take my first sip of this one. He headed off for his refill. Once again, she watched him at the bar. If this was a date, he'd have been the best-looking man she'd ever been out with. Also the wealthiest and the nicest. She thought about that, a date with Patrick Noon. He'd spend $200 on dinner and be a gentleman, and when he said goodnight, and then he'd have rushed home, and then she'd have rushed home so she could tell Eden all about it. But this wasn't a date, and she wasn't going to be rushing home to talk to her daughter ever again. When he returned, she resisted the urge to fill up the silence. This man had his own rhythms, and she knew better than to disturb him. They half listened to that song about Sister Christian as it gargled inside the nearest speaker. You'll hear her voice. She had to run what he'd just said through her mind a few times to make sure she'd heard it right. Okay, she said. Has that happened yet? Danielle knew that if she said anything at that moment, she might lose control. So she simply shook her head. You will, he said. She won't say anything important. I mean, she won't tell you who killed her. No lottery numbers. It'll just be normal stuff. I could probably live with that, Danielle said. That's why I was out there that night driving around. I was asleep, and then I heard Gabby ask me to come pick her up. I mean, obviously I knew it wasn't real, but it unsettled me. So it was a dream. No, not really. Her voice didn't come from inside the sleep, if that makes sense. It came from somewhere else. And no, I don't believe in ghosts. Daniel was wishing this didn't all seem so goddamn plausible. The funny thing was, her voice wasn't like it had been when she was alive. At least not during those bad years, but she wasn't a kid either. It was like what it would have been now. He was still staring at his empty glass. Finally, he looked up at her. So, after I hit the dog, I saw someone. Suddenly, everything in the bar had become a lot clearer and a lot quieter. What do you mean, you saw someone? When I got out of the car to check on the dog, there was a person in there, in the trees at the edge of the property. I tried to speak with him, but he didn't answer. He just stood there, like he was trying to be invisible. And then the dog attacked. When I checked again, he was gone. Do you know who it was? Danielle asked. Yeah, I'm pretty sure I do. Thank you. So, if anyone has any comments, questions? Yes.
As an aficionado of Agatha Christie, and I love the murder mystery genre, I'm always very inquisitive about how authors set around, constructing the plot of it. Is it an image? Is it a story that you have in mind, and then you think of clever ways in which to create decoys to keep us in suspense? Or what is the triggering germ for the construction of the plot for you? I mean, I'm already very intrigued and look forward to reading this.
Oh, well, thank you. A very good question. Well, I guess I can speak with this book. I thought, I have 4 children. They've all been teenagers at one point in their lives. They're all older now. I know some people here who have teenagers. And the one thing about having teenage children is they don't tell you stuff. I mean, they are basically mystery stories walking around your house. So that was kind of the beginning of this, is what if I told a story, a mystery story, in which the people who know what happened are teenagers, and the people who are investigating the crime aren't detectives but are parents. I thought that would be very interesting. I'm pretty sure none of my kids, murdered anybody or committed any kind of actionable felonies, but there have been, times, and there is stuff that influences some of the things in this book. There have been times where you just wonder, what's going on? So I thought to make a murder mystery in which the investigators are people going about the normal act of parenting, because police supposedly are dispassionate, are disinterested. But if you're a parent and you're investigating your child, you know, do you want to know the truth? You know, do you really want to know, or are you going to cover up as you investigate? So that was really the start of the book, and it really gave me, as the writer, a lot of opportunities you know, to sort of play with a little bit. I'm sure other people have done it. I'm not aware off the top of my head, to play with the mystery aspect. So that was really I hope that answers your question a bit. Is really, you're a parent. You desperately have to. Your child is being accused of something or is suspected generally of knowing something. You have to find out what that is, but you're terrified because the truth may very well be a truth that could be your worst nightmare. So that's kind of the book, if you will. Thanks. Anyone else? Yes, Peter Smith.
Do you think cell phones have wrecked books, or do you think they've made them easier in terms of fiction?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I miss a world in which there were no cell phones. Well, I don't know if it's wrecked it. I think there are other things that are wrecking fiction right now. I don't think it's cell phones. But I think that it's amazing how different it makes writing fiction. You know the idea that I have a story that the one novel I've never published, it exists, and it's set in the 80s. And Carol and I were talking about, redoing it, setting it now or dealing with it now. But telling this same story with cell phones would be so laborious to do, would change everything. It's like Tess, when her note goes under the carpet, she could have just texted him, and said, whatever his name was, Tess of Dubervilles. And so, I can't speak to whether or not it's better or worse. I mean, in this book, texting is a huge part of the book. I mean, they did these advertisement postcard bookmarks for the book that were texts taken from the kids texting each other. And I mean, I think the one thing about social media that does fascinate me is how it's just a furtherance of this process I was just talking about. It's become almost for chuggy guys like me, one more level of me not getting what the hell is going on, because you're always one step behind. You're like, I'm on Facebook now. Oh, no, great, you stay there, Dad. Go ahead. It's where the cool people are, and so yeah, I don't know. I mean, it definitely, there's nothing that's changed writing fiction more in my life than the discovery of this thing right here. And but value-wise, I don't know, just roll with it. I mean, Jesus, we got AI coming up, so let's keep an eye on the ball here. That's the threat. Thanks. Anyone else? Going back to the impulse for this book is part of a trilogy of books. I found myself saying actually to someone in Los Angeles the other day, and so now I'm committed to it. But there are 3 books set in this fictional town of Emerson, which Jack Madden may recognize as Wellesley, Massachusetts. Oh, kind of, and Carol may recognize as Newton a little bit. There are 3, and I'm just finishing the second one right now. That was a real Freudian slip right there. I finished the second one right now, and the third one I kind of already know what the plot is, and so that hopefully won't be too much of a challenge. I like to get them, and so they would be like with the Emerson trilogy or whatever. But they all deal with the other thing is, I like when I write mysteries to not really have them be novels of official detection. I like writing about things that the cops sort of make up their minds about pretty quickly and are wrong about, potentially. So the suburbs, I find, are a very good place to do that. And I also think the suburbs, I've lived in suburbs my whole life. I grew up in the suburbs. I I even managed for a while to live in a suburb of London. I don't know how we did that, in Twickenham and Strawberry Hill. And so, I mean, I live in London. Okay, let's do the suburbs. I find the suburbs incredibly menacing, incredibly chocked with danger, and like the mean streets of sort of Upper Saddle River.
That's where all the murders happen.
Yes.
Midsummer murders, like it's just murders.
That's all the good, yes, exactly. That's where all the good murders happen.
Yeah.
And I just was, you know, I mean, it's like, I have so many incidents. I wrote a thing about this, which is in Crime Reads, I think it came out today, about the suburbs as menacing. And this is one story I'm now telling, it seemed to be about when I was 16 as junior. My younger brother was 15, I guess, and his best friend was Jim. And Jim was a tall, gangly, smart kid. And Jim one day showed up at our house and with his brother Chris and said, "We've just been kidnapped." And I'm like, "Really?" And we lived in Allendale, New Jersey, which is as suburban as you get, Bergen County. And he's like, "Yeah," and they had been. They had tape around there, and we escaped. And this guy came, and he held us at gunpoint, and so we're like, and the cops come in, and they never caught the guy. But it was a home invasion. Him and his brother had been home. Well, Jim was my brother's best friend. He also was James Comey, who went on to be James Comey.
Yes.
And he has credited this. And we still, you know, I just sent him the article today, and I outed him. And no, he talks about it in his biography and stuff. But it was just like, that was going on my whole life. You know, it was like, and he credits that moment with, I don't know how you see James Comey, but that's when it started, you know. And so I guess that's a long-winded revisiting your question. Is I think the other thing is the setting is important to me. I grew up in the 60s, and oh my God, the city, you know, it's like, oh, the riots and gangs and all of that. And I was like, I don't know, they look okay to me. I'm just worried about Mr. Fritz across the street. So, Carol.
So whenever you're starting a book, I understand you have something in your mind.
Right.
Does the book ever take on a life of its own?
Oh yeah.
And it goes uncontrollably somewhere you weren't going?
Well, partially
Or
controlled.
controllably. Okay, we'll say
Partially
that.
controlled. Yes. Yes, absolutely. Well, with this one, a good example is Patrick and Danielle, the two guys we saw here. They were both very minor characters in the book. They were not at all, because Danielle's kind of, I mean, I suppose she was kind of a little more major, but they were not, certainly not. There are three other sets of parents who are really central, because they're the parents of the kids who did not die in the Bondurant house. But I like them so much, and I like Patrick so much, and that he just kept going, and his drinking doesn't get better, you know, spoiler alert, and but they become close. They have this bond, and so, you know, yeah. I mean, if that didn't happen, I wouldn't do it. I mean, it's because I can't surprise you guys if I don't surprise myself, unless you're just, again, you know, you can do these things by the numbers, but so I like that. That's why I don't really write very elaborate outlines.
That's why they go into trilogies.
Yeah, right, exactly, and exactly, and but so, you know, but it is a balancing act, because you can lose a novel, you know, and it's a terrible thing. Carol, you be living with someone who loses. I mean, you know, I you know, had novels careen too far out of control.
Okay.
Early-ish, thank God. But yeah.
Very interesting.
What else? Martha.
This isn't a well-formed question,
Okay.
but I think you said her name was Danielle. Is that
Yeah.
the character from Watertown? So she's pretty different from what I'm guessing your own milieu is, and I'm just wondering if you can talk about how you got the confidence to write her.
Well, in a general sense, I love writing female characters. Men aren't very interesting to me. I mean, they're not. I mean, I just don't like. I mean, they're just okay. But you know, but I love writing, and she's actually based on my barber. I had a barber in. Do you ever go to Roosters? Jack? Do you ever go there? You know the one with 100% body tats, the barber there. black hair. That's kind of, I was looking at her, she was my barber, and she just she just was very kind of working class South Boston. And we'd have long talks, and she'd inform me of what's going on AM radio, and it'd always be interesting. But she was just a very kind of rough character. She had literally from here down, as far as you could tell, on her fingers, on everything. And I just started thinking about, her and her life, and she would talk about her life, at no end. And she's a single mom, and she was with bikers, and now she's got her business, and she's really organized, and she's not letting men do that to her anymore, and so she became like the basis for this character. But it is difficult, for me. I have a comfort zone for sure, and Danielle is definitely out of it. But I think by the end, I think it worked out okay. It's a tough time to sort of, be a novelist and to try and be too far afield and so forth. So, I like to write about what I know, and I like to primarily write about what I know. I could never write a novel set in, a different community than the suburbs. I suppose I could. I could, if you paid me, but I wouldn't voluntarily do that. And so, yeah, that's a poorly formed answer to a much better formed question than you thought it was. So, anyone else? Well, thank you all for coming and listening to this. I appreciate it. Oh, Carol was just playing a clip for me from the movie Tootsie, where Bill Murray is talking about, I just want 70 people coming in out of the worst rainstorm in history, coming in. That's my ideal crowd. So. That's you guys. I have their interest until they dry off. So anyway, thanks for coming on.